Right. Good morning. Welcome to Wednesday, week 12, in the last few classes of our term together. Are you sad? Is anyone feeling a little misty? A little bit like, tears maybe? No tears? Oh, okay. That was very convincing, actually. I'll take it. Right. So welcome to Wednesday. Just as a quick reminder, of course, I will not be here on Friday, and so I'm giving you that class to work on your final papers. You don't have to come in here if it doesn't work for you. So if you could go home at this time, you can just go home, or if you were just coming in for this class, then you don't have to. But if you're already here, of course, you can always, good morning. You can always come in and work in here, of course, that's fine. But as I say, I won't be here, so work on your papers in the meantime. And I think yesterday we also said we'd have our last quiz on Wednesday of next week. And so I posted that in Microsoft Teams, and it'll be the same kind of thing we usually do where I do the online quizzes for people who cannot come to school. I do those first, and then at 11 o'clock, people who are in person can come in and write their quiz as they normally do.
Sure.
Yeah, same thing. Okay. Oh yeah, let's say good morning to people who are here. So good morning, Mike. Mike is here. Good morning, Salah. Gabrielle is here. Good morning, Gabrielle. Daniel's here. Hello, Daniel. Vicky is here. Hello, Vicky. And Shamimu is here. Hello. Okay. Here we go. So yesterday we started talking about religious oppression, right? Yet another form of oppression that we find in our societies. Here in this case, of course, we're looking at people who are systematically disadvantaged or discriminated against or denied opportunities or suffering some sort of poor treatment simply because of the religious values or religious affiliations that they hold, right? And so often we see that religious oppression show up in terms of structural inequalities, so laws that are unequally applied between religious groups. And again, religious oppression can occur even in societies where freedom of religion is a constitutional right. Hint, hint, we are going to look at just such a situation. I need to set up a few things here in terms, just so we understand religious oppression in Canada. I just need to set up a few pieces of background information that you will need to understand. And the first one, of course, is the simple fact that Christians are the dominant group in Canada, right? So about half of Canadians identify themselves as some version of Christian, whether it's Catholic or Protestant or some other group of Christians. But a pretty big chunk of Canadians are religiously unaffiliated. And so they either don't really strongly believe in or practice a religion, or they don't believe in any sort of higher power, or they're just kind of not sure about what, if there is a higher power or not. So a good chunk of, almost a third of Canadians are, non-religious, if we will. But certainly the dominant group are people with Christians or Christian backgrounds. And so, yeah, the breakdown of this is roughly 30% Catholic, 18% Protestant, which for our purposes are the same, although they're not. And again, yeah, 30% of Canadians are non-religious. The group of sort of minoritized religious groups in Canada are a small percentage, as you can see, maybe only about 8 or 10%, but that percentage is probably growing, right? We're accepting more immigrants from other countries, often they're non-Christian countries, and so we have an increasing population of Hindus and Sikhs, Jewish people, Buddhists, Muslims. All of these people are kind of growing in percentage, right? And I said, of course, that probably the most vulnerable in terms of religious oppression are these groups here. And I suggested that because often they are more visible in society. And so they'll often wear kind of evidence of their their faith. And so when you see someone like me walking down the street, a member of the dominant group, you can't really tell what my religious affiliation is, right? I don't wear any clothing or jewelry or symbols that suggest what my religious affiliation might be. But of course, not all religions are like that. Some encourage or require certain clothing to be worn or certain symbols to be worn. And so people like Sikhs, people like Muslims, people like Jewish people are often more visible in society than are Christians. Not always, but often, right? And I think that makes them more vulnerable because, again, they're in a minoritized group, but they're also more visible, right? They're very visible to society in terms of their difference, right? Does that make sense? Is that okay so far? Okay. Right, and so this is kind of an open and an interesting question for Canada because, again, one of the questions that Canada always will need to answer is how do we get groups of different people to work together, right? And so we've got sort of Canadians who have been here for some time. We have Canadians who are newly arrived immigrants, some who are citizens, some who have PR, some who don't have either of those things. We have Indigenous people. We have different religions, different cultures, different values. How do we get all those people to work together, right? How do we get them to see themselves as Canadian, whatever that is? And how do we get people to sort of cooperate and live in harmony, right? That's an open question for Canada, and I think it's an important one. And I think, if we look to the States, and again, I don't mean to paint the States as, this awful place, but, I think that they're really struggling with how to get a society to cooperate as a whole, right? And so they're very polarized in terms of Democrats and Republicans, and so those two sides don't want to listen to each other or cooperate, so the country is basically split in half in that way, but it's also split with regard to social or economic class. It's also split with regard to race, and so the U.S. is kind of, I think, struggling to find a way to cooperate with each other. And so I don't mean to constantly look down there and say, ugh, how horrible. But, it's a good lesson for us here in Canada to pay attention to making sure that we find a way to see ourselves as all on the same team, because the Americans don't feel that way, right? Even if you remove race or gender from the equation, even if you just look at Democrat and Republican, those two sides can't seem to cooperate, right? And you can see how destructive it is for the entire country and for the world. And so it's a good lesson for us in Canada with so many different groups of people. We should pay attention to how to make sure that everybody feels included and everybody feels like, even though there are differences between us, that we're all on Team Canada, right? We're all pulling in the same direction. Team Canada, yeah. So I said one of the important parts of, I think, what Canada is, both legally but also kind of spiritually, if you will, is our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so I said that it was part of our Constitution, and that was important because constitutions are difficult to change, right? They can't just be overturned by the House of Commons in Ottawa. You need to do a lot of work to change these things. So these things are basically, they're not written in stone, but they're close, right? They're very difficult to change. And I said, one of the things that I'm kind of proud of, although I didn't really have anything to do with it, I was 5 or 5 or 6 when it was, instituted. I didn't have anything to do with this, but I am proud of the fact that all of these rights and freedoms apply to everyone in Canada, with the exception of those two. But I'm proud to say that, if you are in Canada, these rights apply to you. It doesn't matter if you're a Canadian citizen or not, right? And I really like that we extend those rights not just to our citizens, but to anyone who is in our country. This whole thing kind of gets started, I guess, this human rights thing gets started in 1948 with the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the UN. And so this comes out after the Second World War. People are witnesses to the horrors of the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. And so as a result, the UN drafts this Declaration of Human Rights. And so all countries unanimously approve it and they sign on to it. The degree to which they actually follow it is a different story, but this was kind of unanimously received in 1948. Here in Canada, our Charter of Rights and Freedoms goes through a few steps. Originally, there's a Canadian Bill of Rights, but that's just a regular law. And so, again, it can be changed or overturned by the House of Commons, but it's a good kind of first step in establishing the rights and freedoms of Canadians. I'm just going to skip over that. That's a lot of information. But the real one gets added to the Constitution in '82 when, again, Justin Trudeau's dad, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, as Prime Minister, brings our Constitution home from the UK and gets all provinces to sign on to it except Quebec, because Quebec isn't happy with a few things in it. But can't make everybody happy, I guess. I don't know. The important part of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms for us here is there's all these different sections having to do with rights and freedoms of Canadians. The fundamental freedoms is what we're paying attention to right now, because it says that everyone has the freedom of conscience and religion, right? So you're allowed to kind of think what you want to think and believe what you want to believe and worship the God that you want to worship, or gods that you want to worship. Yeah, and so, and you're allowed to express those beliefs as well. And so if you believe in God or Allah or Yahweh or some other set of deities, you may believe in these things and you may express that belief as well, right? So you don't have to hide your religion from everyone. You're allowed to express what you believe in. You're allowed to assemble peacefully. So if you want to, have a mass or a gathering or some sort of ritual assembly of people, you are allowed to do that. Yeah, and you're allowed to associate in that regard as well. And so these things are protected in Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms, right? They're the highest law in the land, if you will. Now, there's two limits to these rights and freedoms, okay? So the first one is that all of these rights are supposed to be interpreted with reasonable limits, right? And basically what that means is that, yes, you have the right to all of these things within reason, right? And maybe more specifically, you're not allowed to use your rights to infringe on the rights of others, right? So me kind of believing in my God or religion or spiritual beliefs, I can't do that in such a way that limits you from practicing your religious beliefs or any of your other fundamental freedoms, right? So you may only enjoy and exercise your rights in a way that doesn't limit or take away the rights of others. Okay, so that's an important point, because sometimes these rights come into conflict, and we have to decide whose rights will supersede whose, right? So sometimes these things can get complicated. And we will talk about that. I have an example. The other one that's tricky is this notwithstanding clause. Does anyone know what notwithstanding means? Can somebody Google it for me really quickly? Because I can define it for you, but I'm horrible at defining words. So I'm worried I may make it worse. But what does notwithstanding mean? It's not a word that gets used in sort of regular speech very much. In spite of, nevertheless, although, in spite of the fact that. Okay, so it says so notwithstanding means nevertheless, or in spite of, or although, or in spite of the fact that. Yeah. So it's kind of saying, like, never mind this thing over here, we're doing this anyway, right? So something notwithstanding we're going to do this, right? And so it kind of cancels out the previous part of whatever you're talking about, or the previous part of your sentence. And how it works here is that there is a notwithstanding clause in the Constitution that says that provincial or federal governments can pass a law that violates a charter right, okay? Now, I'm not sure how entirely I agree with this notwithstanding clause, but it was placed into the Constitution as a bit of a compromise because a lot of the provinces saw the first draft of this Charter of Rights and Freedoms and they said, hey, we won't be able to make any laws in our province. This will kind of bind our hands too tightly and we won't be able to do anything. So we want a notwithstanding clause. And so again, this allows a government to pass a law that overrides a charter right. And in theory, you shouldn't be able to do this, right? In theory, your rights and freedoms should be guaranteed to you by the Constitution, which they are unless the government uses the notwithstanding clause to pass a law in conflict with this. So it's a little bit of a backdoor, right? It's a little bit of a loophole in the system that allows a government to go around a charter right or to violate it. Now, for the most part, most governments don't use this very often because do you think people like to have their rights or freedoms taken away? No, they do not, right? So most governments realize that and do not use the notwithstanding clause because it's just too problematic, right? People will push back, they'll be angry. Most governments don't like people to be angry at them because then they won't get voted in next time. So most governments kind of tread carefully around this idea. But not all provinces do that. The other thing I think we need to know is that if you feel that your rights have been violated, okay, so if the government or an organization or someone has violated your charter rights, you may take it to, you may take legal action, right? So there's BC, every province has a human rights tribunal, a human rights court, but you also may find that if your case kind of goes high enough, it can actually be heard by the Supreme Court of Canada. Okay, so the Supreme Court is the highest court in Canada, and it only hears cases that it wants to hear. So you can't make the Supreme Court listen to you. You can only ask them to hear your case, and they will choose if they want to hear it or not. And basically, they only rule on things that are precedent setting. What's a precedent? Important. Precedents are important. Precedent is a precedent, so it's a thing that came before. So when there's a precedent for something, that means that it's something you've done in the past, so you should probably do it in the future, right? So if our precedent here at Columbia College is to, oh gosh, I don't know, always give our staff the week between Christmas and New Year's off, which we don't. But if that was the precedent, and if we had done that for years and years, there would be pressure on us to do it every year, right? Because we've always done it. And so the Supreme Court likes to decide on cases that will set a precedent, right? So we weren't sure what to do in this case, we decided this, and now every time a similar issue comes up, people will look back into the past and say, okay, what did we do in the past in this situation? And so the Supreme Court likes to set precedents in that way, but they also hear cases that have that are constitutional issues. So in one instance, this was a few years ago, our conservative government had passed a new set of changes to the criminal code around prostitution, and it made it made life less safe for people engaged in prostitution and sex work. And so there was a challenge to that law, and it went to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Supreme Court of Canada said to the government, actually, your prostitution law is unconstitutional. It violates the rights of people to safety and to be able to work, and so you need to change this law. Your law is unconstitutional. So the Supreme Court gave the government a year to change their law. And so this is kind of the other nice thing about Canada, is that the Supreme Court can tell the government what to do, right? And if they are violating the rights of people or organizations, a case can go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court can make the government change it. And so in the case of the prostitution law, they said, yes, you have a year to change the law, otherwise it will be inactive. So if you don't change it, the law is canceled in a year. It's no longer in effect. So you better come up with something better. So you should know that. And the other thing you should know is that again, the Constitution can be changed officially, but it's a 750 rule. So you need 7 provinces representing 50% of Canada's population to approve this change. And then you can change it, which is a lot, right? So you can't just change it willy-nilly whenever you want. You actually have to do a lot of work and get a lot of people to agree to it. And again, it's not easy. We've tried twice in the past. Hasn't worked out. We haven't managed to get agreement. And at this point, I don't think anyone has any appetite to make constitutional changes. And so it kind of is, it is what it is for the moment. All right. Oh, yeah. So if something goes to the Supreme Court of Canada, they decide based on these kind of 3 questions, right? So did the government or one of its agencies restrict a right or a freedom, okay? Is the right or freedom protected by the Charter? And was the restriction reasonable under Section 1? So again, all of those rights are yours within reasonable limits. And so was the restriction a reasonable one? And if it wasn't, or if the government did restrict a right or freedom that is protected by the Charter, again, the Supreme Court can overturn it. And once the Supreme Court decides, that's it. There's no appeals, there's no higher court. They get the final say. So when they say your law is unconstitutional, that's it. Your law is unconstitutional. You have no further recourse. The Supreme Court has decided, right? So they have the final say on things like this. And again, the government doesn't have to like it, but that's just how the system works. So this brings us to a specific incident that is still playing out in Canada today. And it has to do with Quebec's ban on religious symbols. And so in Quebec, I don't know if you know anything about Quebec, but Quebec is traditionally, historically, a French province in Canada. Roughly about maybe 50 or so % of people living in Quebec are sort of Quebecois, so they're kind of ethnically, culturally, linguistically French. That 50% might not be the exact statistic, but I think it's about 50. And so they're kind of, within that province, the French are the dominant group, right? So here in Canada, white people are the dominant group. English is kind of, in Canada, is the most common language, even though we have French is our other official language, but outside of Quebec, not many people use French. But in Quebec, French people are the dominant group. They're the ones that have social and cultural and institutional power. And so on March 29th here of last year, the Quebec legislature, the provincial government, passed a ban on religious symbols. And what the law said was that it reaffirmed that the state was non-religious. And so Quebec, once upon a time, had a pretty close relationship between the government and the Catholic Church. But in the 1960s, they kind of separated that out, and they wanted to be a non-religious government. And so they are a secular state. So they're reaffirming that the government is not a religious entity. And they say that, the law bans public workers from wearing religious symbols while they are at work. Okay? So it also, well, we'll get to that in a second. It also mandates that you must have your face uncovered to give or to receive public services. So again, if you are someone who covers their face for cultural or religious reasons, you must uncover your face in order to go to a government office and interact with them, to fill out forms or to get benefits or ask questions or whatever. Okay? So this is the law that was passed. And so what are your initial reactions to hearing about this?
Not surprised.
Why are you not surprised?
Yeah, like in the past, like Quebec, like has like some, like Quebec is different from many other provinces, right?
They are.
Always like act against the law.
They always act against the law?
Yeah, like they always like this law is not good, this law is not good.
Yeah, they do have a bit of a reputation here in Canada. That is true. What else? What else do you think about what I'm telling you here, or what else do you know about Quebec? No, I will say maybe that again, Quebec is always a little bit of a world apart from the rest of Canada, and so again, they're a very populous province, right? I don't know if they have more population than Ontario, but Ontario and Quebec are the big, populous, powerful provinces, and then there's kind of everyone else. And so, Quebec is a big province in Canada. They're a powerful province in Canada, but in terms of their language and their culture and their kind of values, they're a little bit different from the rest of Canada. And sometimes we kind of disagree with how Quebec sees things, and often we see very different approaches and ideas about certain situations coming from Quebec. So again, they're a part of Canada, and they're totally Canadians, but sometimes they see things from a slightly different perspective than a lot of the rest of Canada does.
You're from Quebec, right?
I am, yes, I was born in Quebec. My family left when I was 4 years old. We used to live in Montreal. I was born in Montreal. But we're not ethnically or culturally French. We're English, which is kind of why we left. It's a long story. But things were a little bit uncomfortable in Quebec for English people in the 1970s and and so as a result we left, as did many English people in that decade. Okay, yes. Right. So yeah, there's a little bit of question of neutrality here, right? Because it's going to affect some religions differently than others, right? So I can be a very hardcore Catholic, right? I can be super Catholic, but am I required to wear anything by my religion? No, Catholicism doesn't require me to dress in a certain way or to wear any symbols of my faith, right? Lots of people do wear a little cross, right? Sometimes you'll see a little cross necklace, but you're not required to wear it. They just want to. But as we know, there are other religions where there is a strong requirement to either dress in a particular way or to wear the symbols of your faith, right? And so, yeah, some people are going to be disproportionately affected by a law like this, right? So yeah, neutral is questionable, right? Who would you include in public workers? Who are public workers?
Who interact with other people?
What's that?
Who interact with other people?
People who interact with other people, yes. Yes, but in this case, it's just a little different than that.
People who work in the government?
Yeah, people who work in the government or maybe more broadly, people who are paid by the government. So think of transit workers, think of teachers, think of lawyers, some lawyers,
Public defender.
public defenders, yeah, judges, um, healthcare workers, people in any type of government office you can imagine. There's a government office next door, right? Canada Revenue Agency is right next door. Who else? Who else works for the government? What's that? Police, yeah. Police. Politicians. Who else? Actually, that's a pretty big list already, right? If you include everybody who works in a school, everybody who works in a hospital, everybody who works in the criminal justice system for the government, judges, lawyers, all sorts of people. People who work in the government themselves, whether they're in an office or whether they're representing people in parliament. There's a huge, huge list of people that all of a sudden are being denied the ability to simply wear what their religion requires them to wear, or even just to express their faith because they want to, right? Okay, here's what we'll do. I want to talk about this more, but first I want to talk about it from kind of an inside out view, because of course it's hard for me to really speak to this because I don't live in Quebec anymore. I'm not a religious person. And if I was, I likely wouldn't be a religious person that is strongly affected by a law like this. So I want to read an article that talks a little bit about the effect of a law like this, okay? And so the law comes from, I'm just going to pull it up here so I can remember. I pulled it from, I think, the Globe and Mail. See here. Yeah, I pulled it from the Globe and Mail almost a year ago, so December 2019. And it talks about, in the article they speak to, I think, 4 or 5 people, most of them I believe are Muslim women, who are disproportionately affected by a law like this. And so these women will talk about their experience in Quebec, a little bit about their background, and how a law like this has significantly affected the course of their lives, okay? And so what I'll do is I'll give you some time to read this, and then there's a lot of questions, but they're fairly simple. They're fairly simple questions to answer, so I don't think don't be freaked out too much by it. So for online people, or for even in-person people, the article is in Microsoft Teams, and it's called "I Feel Like a Stranger Here Now." And maybe what I'll do is I'll give you about 15 minutes to read, and then maybe we can talk about it, okay? Or we'll just see where we are after 15 minutes. So I'll let you start reading, and then again, in 15 minutes, we'll kind of see where we are. And now we're back. So let's just take 2 more minutes to finish reading and sort of getting our ideas together, and then we'll talk about these questions, okay? Just 2 minutes. I'll put it on the clock. Okay, let's talk about this. So again, this is a fairly easy article to read, right? This is just sort of the personal experience of a number of women from Quebec. So in general, what kind of feelings are these women expressing in response to this religious symbols law that's been passed?
Disappointed.
Yeah, disappointment. What are they? Who or what are they disappointed in?
Like they have spent like all their life living in Quebec and feel like a Quebecois, and now like this law is passed and they feel like they're a second-class citizen.
Yeah, so these women have grown up in Quebec. They've been raised in Quebec. In some cases, their parents were born in Quebec as well, and so they feel that that's that's their home, right? That's part of their identity. And now, because of this law, they feel that suddenly they don't belong, right? They feel like a second-class citizen. What other feelings are they expressing?
They're nervous
They're nervous. What are they nervous about?
because they feel like discrimination against Muslim women increased after the law is passed.
Right. So after the passing of this bill, it seems that hate crimes and just crimes in general against Muslims seems to have increased a little bit, and so these women they're nervous, right? They fear for their safety. What else?
They're willing to fight against.
Yeah, they're willing to, they're disappointed and upset, but they're also willing to oppose this law and to fight it, right? How else? What else did they talk about?
Insecurity.
Sorry?
Insecurity.
In what way?
Their abilities in their job fields are tested and doubted. So people who work years on their degree now don't have a stable future. They're insecure about how people view them, and
Yeah. There's a lot of insecurity and maybe uncertainty as well, right? Because these women are, on the verge of embarking on their career path, right? They're either starting university or finishing university, or they're kind of partway into their careers as teachers or lawyers, and suddenly, everything has been kind of, it's like the floor has been slanted the other way, right? And now suddenly they have to figure out, their original career path is blocked or will now have to change, right? And they're not sure, and they're not kind of sure what to expect from the future, right? And they're not really sure what their plan is going to be because they had things figured out, they had a rough plan, and now this law has changed things for them, right? It's closed doors for them. Anything else? Anything else that these women are expressing? Fear of or from?
Basically, incites discrimination. Basically, very subtly supports hate crimes against these women, so they now have to fear for their own safety.
Yeah. So this law, even though it might seem fairly benign on the surface, right? It may not seem like a big deal. It seems to have increased assaults and hate crimes against Muslims and against Muslim women, and so these women probably rightly fear for their safety, right? On that topic, why do you think that hate crimes do or did increase after the passing of this law?
Internalized hatred is now put in a law where it makes it, oh, you actually can't do this anymore. Like, usually before that, maybe you didn't like it and you kept it to yourself because the law allowed it. But when the government says, hey, these people are not allowed to wear headscarves, and suddenly your internalized oppression or hatred is validated, so you have the right to act.
Yeah.
on it.
Yeah, exactly, right? When the government does something like this, that is that supports discrimination or supports people's prejudicial ideas, yeah, it validates those ideas, right? And all of a sudden, people who may have been Islamophobic, which I don't even like the term. I've used it a couple times, and I don't like it. A phobia is like this unnatural fear you have that you can't control, right? If you're arachnophobic, you have a terrible fear of spiders and you can't control it, even though spiders are harmless. But nobody has a phobia of Muslims, right? They have intolerance and prejudice and hatred toward Muslims. It's not a phobia. So I don't even like the term. But anyway, that's just my own little thing. But yeah, those people who have those views already they feel they're legitimate, right? The government is backing them up, so now they feel even more comfortable expressing their views and even, basically committing crimes, right? Assaulting people that they have prejudicial ideas about, right? So that's dangerous, right? The government has, and I think we saw this with Donald Trump too, the government has a pretty strong responsibility to stand up against crimes of all kinds, right? Because again, as soon as you appear to legitimize them, it gets worse, right? People will start acting on it and thinking that, oh, now the government's got my back. I'm going to do or say this thing that before I wouldn't say or do. And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Are there any other maybe answers to that one? The idea of why hate crimes might increase as a result of this bill? I think that's probably the answer, but I just wanted to see if there was anything else. Is there anything else? No? So in theory, this law applies to everyone, right? Everyone who works for the public sector, this law applies to. But who's disproportionately affected and why? And I think, Avera, you kind of answered that question before we even read the article, but who is disproportionately affected by this law? Women are, and more specifically? Muslim women, yeah. So again, this law applies to everyone, but not equally, right? And so white people who, who may be religious but are not required to display or wear any evidence of their faith, they're not affected at all, right? But people who do wear articles of clothing or symbols of their faith, particularly women, are much more drastically affected by this law. And so again, you can very easily say, oh, well, it applies to everyone, so it's fair. But it's not fair because, it doesn't apply to those people because of the way the law is, written, right? And so, these women and others too. I mean, they could have spoken to, say Sikh police officers. They would be affected, or members of the military. Sorry, this is a tangent, but our defense minister, do you know who our defense minister in Canada is? So this is basically the guy, this is the guy who's in charge of our military here in Canada. Where is he? Here he is. That's Harjit Sajjan. So he's the Minister of Defense. Let me just see here. Yeah. So he's the minister. He's the Right Honorable Harjit Sajjan, leader of our military, Minister of Defense. But according to Quebec's religious symbols law, he can't wear his turban and work for the government. Of course, Quebec has no jurisdiction because he's a federal minister, so they can't touch him. But still, according to their law, he wouldn't be able to hold this position because he's wearing a religious symbol.
Wait, Jagmeet Singh also wear like a turban, and he's like.
Jagmeet Singh is another one, and hang on, I'm gonna bring him up here.
Wait, NDP like support Quebec, right?
Well, where is he? Yeah, this is him here. There he is. Yeah. So Jagmeet Singh is another person who might be affected by this religious symbols ban in Canada. Fortunately, he's a federal. He's the leader of the New Democratic Party at the federal level. And he's also an MP. So again, the Quebec law can't touch him. They don't have jurisdiction federally. But he's also a lawyer. And so this guy here, Jagmeet Singh, cannot practice law for the Quebec government because wearing a religious symbol, right? And so, again, I'm just going to go back here. So yeah, some people are, of course, disproportionately affected. And even though the law claims that it applies to everyone, the reality is that it doesn't really apply to everyone. It just applies to a small minority. And that minority is already a vulnerable minoritized group or a collection of minoritized groups already, right? And so, again, that should be a bit of an alarm bell for us, right? One of the women here, the graduate student, and her name is Bara Arar. Hope I pronounced her name right. I'm sorry if I didn't. She says people who are not affected by the bill, or people who do not identify with those affected, don't understand the immediacy of these politics. Why is she saying that, and what's she kind of talking about in terms of concepts we've dealt with in this course? Right. Yeah. So there's a privilege element and there's a positionality element, right? And the privilege thing is that, one of the things about having privilege is that you're often not discriminated against, and you can pretty safely ignore discrimination because it's not pointed at you, right? And so lots of Quebec people are just going to go on with their lives in their regular fashion. Nothing will change for them, whatever. They can just ignore this whole issue. But of course, for some people, this law has turned their life upside down, right? So there's a privilege aspect in terms of some people can safely ignore it. The other thing that might be going on here is that depending on your place in society, you may not even see what the issue is here at all, right? So white French Quebecers may look at this and say, well, what's the big deal, right? Like, we won't wear our religious symbols, you don't wear your religious symbols. It's all fair. What's the big deal, right? So it would be very easy to look at it that way from that perspective. But again, from the perspective of a Muslim woman, she's basically being asked to assimilate here, right? Her choices are this: assimilate, right? Take off your niqab, take off your face covering. Sikh men, take off your turbans and be like us. If you want a place in society, you have to be like us. Or what's their other option? Yeah, or get out, right? And you can see some of these women are considering it, right? Some women are choosing to maybe study in Toronto rather than McGill. I forget which young woman said, but she said her parents had gone to McGill, right? McGill is in Montreal. And her parents had gone to McGill, and she wanted to go there too because that's where her parents went. But she may not be able to unless she removes the symbols of her faith. And so now she may have to go to school in Toronto, right? Another young woman was just finishing her education degree, and she said, yeah, I might go to another province, to Calgary, or she might go to UAE instead, right? So again, some people's lives carry on with no effect, the dominant group, and they can totally ignore this issue and it doesn't affect them. But for the minoritized group here, it hugely affects their lives, and in a way that they can't ignore, right? And again, the government's basically giving them a choice: assimilate or get out, right? And they certainly haven't phrased it that way. That's a very blunt and unflattering way to state this, but that's basically what's being said, right? And again, people who are in the dominant group, it's very easy to say, well, we're not wearing our religious symbols, so don't wear yours. But it's not the same thing, right? Because Christianity doesn't require you to wear anything in particular, right? It's not, Christianity doesn't have any of those kind of rules within it. And so it's very easy to make a rule saying, don't wear any religious symbols if your religion already doesn't wear religious symbols, right? That's an easy law to make. But for people who are required to or are encouraged to, it's a totally different thing, right? And it's a discriminatory situation.
Well, why a sudden change, especially like 2019, which is really recent?
Oh yeah.
Why now? Or are you asking why now, or are you asking aren't we past this already?
I mean, like, yeah, especially I think, I don't really remember when was the Black Lives Matter and stuff, but it's like against discrimination and everything. In 2019, we have these issues, right? And why a sudden change, especially in religion?
Well, something that might answer I'm not sure if I can entirely answer your question because I don't know, I don't get it either. But one thing I didn't mention about Quebec has a long history of using the notwithstanding clause. And so when, in the 1960s, Quebec kind of underwent a change. And so in about maybe the 1940s or 50s, Quebec was kind of half, it was English and French mostly. And what they found was that most French people were kind of in rural areas, they were farming, they were out in the countryside because that was culturally important to them. And it was really English people who came to the cities. And as a result, it was English people who created businesses and owned businesses and kind of made the money and gained power in Quebec. And so in about the 1950s, French Quebecers look around and they say, oh, okay, this was supposed to be our province of Quebec, this is supposed to be a French province, and yet it seems like the English people have all the money and all the power. What's going on here? And so they started to take steps to kind of vote people into power who would put French nationalism and culture and language first. And so they did that. They started to vote people into power who would do that. And then they started to make a series of laws that ensured that were there to protect French language and culture, because they felt they were kind of this small French minority in a sea of English Canadians, and they were worried that they would just blend in and disappear and their culture would be lost. And so Quebec has all kinds of laws in terms of French is the official language of business. So if you want to do business in Quebec, you speak French. In government offices, French is the official language, so you speak French. Schools are French, and so students who go to school in Quebec learn in French. Signage, so if you own a store, if you own a Subway or any kind of store, the sign needs to be in French. And you can have an English translation too, but the French has to be bigger, and it has to be bigger by a certain amount. There's all kinds of laws and protections they put into place. And a lot of those kind of technically violate charter rights. And so they use the notwithstanding clause a bunch of times in order to protect their kind of minority culture and language and status. And so in that way, there's precedent. There we go. There's a precedent for using the notwithstanding clause in Quebec. They've used it a whole ton of times. And in fact, a huge number of the laws they pass require the notwithstanding clause to work. So there is precedent for it to happen. And this is just one more use of it. The other thing is that, as I think it's fair to say that anti-Muslim prejudice has been slowly increasing over the past 20 years or so. And I think it kind of began with 9/11. I think that put Muslim people on the radar of the West in a way that they hadn't been before. And I think the fact that immigration continues, we get huge numbers of people into Canada every year. A number of them are Muslims. And so I think as time has gone on, their prejudicial ideas and fears have increased. And so I think there's kind of two things going on there, this increasing anti-Muslim prejudice and the fact that Quebec has a history of using the notwithstanding clause to protect their culture as they see it. And so, but the other part of that question is aren't we past this? Aren't we talking about Black Lives Matter and racism and all these kinds of things? How can we have a situation like this? Which I think is your question, right? Yeah, and I don't know. All I can say is, again, Quebec is a bit of a different world than the rest of Canada in that regard. And so, something like that would never fly in British Columbia, for instance. But in Quebec, it does fly for those reasons, unfortunately. Yeah, so there's a bit of privilege and a bit of positionality going on. Lots of people can ignore this law and their lives don't change, but as we can see, some people's lives are pretty significantly changed. Here, this young woman, Noor Farhat, who I believe was the lawyer, she says that I live in a democracy of public display that responds to populist majority opinion at the expense of visible minorities. What's she talking about here? What is Ms. Farhat talking about here?
That the country, they go more of majority minority.
Right, so the politicians are really only paying attention to the majority rather than minorities. That's true. That's true.
Societal norms or rules are constructed with the dominant group in mind, and although that can just basically be it, but it's at the expense of minoritized groups. They disadvantage from these laws, and because the dominant group make up the majority, it doesn't matter. It's still passed anyway.
Right. So there's two things, right? The idea that laws and social norms and values are constructed in alignment with the dominant group. And this is a perfect example, right? It's a law that, certainly doesn't disadvantage the dominant group and probably benefits them, right? Because, if I'm a white, non-religious or even Christian man in Quebec, and suddenly all of these people can't work in government anymore because they want to wear their religious clothing or symbols, well, that makes it easy for me, right? I'm going to be more successful because I don't have to compete with all those people, right? Those people are going to find work elsewhere, or they'll just, leave the province, right? So I'm actually going to be advantaged by this situation, right? So, yeah, we have a law that's constructed in alignment with the dominant group norms. So the idea that Christians don't usually wear religious symbols. And the passing of this law not only doesn't disadvantage the dominant group, but it actually advantages the dominant group. And again, minoritized groups are even more disadvantaged than they were to begin with, right? So I'm sure these women have dealt with, I'm sure they say they've dealt with racism and prejudice and discrimination in the past. And now, not only has some of those things got worse in terms of things people say to them on the street or physical attacks, but the government seems to be actively discriminating against them in a legal way, right? And so, again, sorry, I don't have anything smart to say at the end of that. What is populism? What's populism? Do you want to Google that for me very quickly? I can define that for you too, probably pretty well, but just in case. Adhering to what the majority wants? It's pretty close.
A political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established elite group.
Right. So, yeah, you're looking at the majority, but mostly you're looking at the people who are, who feel disadvantaged, and basically what you do is you tell them that they're right, right? So you might have a bunch of people saying, immigrants are ruining our country, and a populist leader would say, yeah, they are. We got to do something about that, even though there is, no evidence for that, and that's not true. Immigrants are not ruining anyone's country, but because the people feel that way, a populist leader will tell them that they're right in order to gain power, right? So populist leaders aren't concerned about protecting minorities. They're not concerned about the truth or what's right. They're interested in gaining power by telling the people what they want to hear, right? Whatever they say, and Donald Trump is a very clear example of a populist leader, because there's people saying, hey, we're disadvantaged, everyone's laughing at us, and Trump's like, yeah, everyone is laughing at us, you're right, and immigrants are ruining our country, and Trump says, yeah, you're right, immigrants are ruining our country, we need to put up a wall. And so, all of this stuff is bananas, right? But he very easily tells people what they want to hear, and so he gains power because of it. And so Ms. Farhat here is basically accusing the Quebec government of doing the same thing, right? People have prejudicial ideas towards Muslims or people of color or people of certain religious affiliations. And so here the government is going along with it. They're like, okay, you can't show any of those religious symbols if you work for the government, right? And of course, the dominant group will be very comfortable with that, but it's clearly discriminatory towards the minoritized group, right? I don't know what other lessons we were supposed to take from her statement. This is the problem. Sometimes I write these questions like a year ago, and then by the time I get back to them again, I'm like, I don't remember what I was thinking when I wrote that question, but whatever answer you might have, I'm open to hearing. I don't know what I expected to hear, but very quickly, what does it mean to be a second-class citizen? Oh yeah, of course, Anna. What does it mean to be a second-class citizen?
A less superior citizen.
yeah, a less superior citizen, right? In theory, if you're a citizen of any country, you have a certain set of rights and freedoms and access to resources, right? But here she's saying, well, that's not the case here in Quebec, because it seems like, you know, some people have all these rights and then some people have less, right? So they're a different class of citizen. Yes, they're still part of Quebec, but they don't get all the same rights and freedoms that everyone else gets. And I guess this is kind of, number 7, I guess is kind of the question that Anna was asking before, is like how does something like this get passed? How do we wind up with a law actually like this is a legal, this is a full-on law. This is the real deal. How does this manage to get passed, do you think? Because it happened. How does something like this get passed?
Quebec, all the majority of them feel this way, or they feel the need to protect their culture, then chances are, unfortunately, that the people governing Quebec is made up of the dominant group. So this is passed because no one brings up the issues that the minorities feel.
Right. So yeah, I think it's very clear that the people who have institutional power here in Quebec are members of the dominant group. And so they're not hearing or not listening to or not caring about the needs of minoritized groups, right? They're kind of being a little bit populist, right? They're just playing to the majority, right? What else? How else does this law get passed?
I think like it is passed to protect the French culture. Like usually like French doesn't have that much Muslim, so they want to French like.
Well, it's true, right? Like, you know, one might understand their desire to protect their own language and culture, but does this really do that? Does it protect their culture, or does it simply push out others?
Push out other.
Also conceal law with neutrality of religion. So when you phrase it nicely, enough people will just go, okay, that's good.
Yeah. So they're kind of hiding behind this proposed neutrality, right? Oh, it's neutral, right? We're not taking a side. It's equal for all people. But again, I think we pretty clearly see that that's not true. It's not equal for all people. If Sikhs had institutional power in Quebec, so if Sikhs had control of Quebec legislature and lawmaking, would Sikhs have passed a law like this? Hell no, right? Again, it's very easy to pass a law that doesn't affect you, right? So, yeah, it's very easy to pass laws that don't affect you, especially, yeah, it's easy to pass laws that don't affect you. Don't forget also that the notwithstanding clause has a role in this, right? The only way that Quebec could pass a law like this is with the notwithstanding clause. Without it, they would be violating these people's charter rights, and it would, and it couldn't pass, right? It couldn't be, or, yeah, it couldn't pass. Now that said, there currently is a challenge against this law. And so basically, as soon as it was passed, a number of people got together and started a legal claim to challenge the validity of this law, right? So Ms. Farhat here, the lawyer, she's part of that challenge, and they're going to go before the Quebec Provincial Court and say, this law is discriminatory, it disadvantages people, it must be struck down, it must be removed. And you can see here that, as you read in the article, the Quebec government agreed that it discriminated against people and it had a significant effect on their life, but the court failed to basically sort of put a pause on the law. So the law is still in effect. So this is actually actively discriminating against people of basically non-white religions, if you will, currently discriminating against them as we speak. And so this court case will kind of continue, and I suspect it will find its way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court will probably have to rule on this eventually. But I guess we'll see what happens. I'm actually, after this class, I'll do a little more research and figure out where we are, because again, that was a year ago. So I'm not sure how the legal battle has proceeded since then. But sometimes these things take a few years to work out, which is unfortunate, because for a few years, these women are going to be, well, yeah, they're going to have to sort of completely reorganize their life plan, because they won't be able to go to school or practice law or get a promotion or get a job in Quebec simply because of the fact that they wear a religious symbol, right? Okay, any questions? Are we good?
Yep.
Okay, I'm gonna let you go then, and we'll come back tomorrow. We'll talk a little bit more about religious oppression, and I think I have an example that talks about the reasonable limits and how we decide whose rights should be, whose rights take precedence when rights are in conflict. Okay, so maybe a more interesting case, or a more complicated one, or maybe not. Either way, we'll see what you think tomorrow. Okay, bye.